The images that portray our national heritage are many and diverse, but none so clearly symbolizes the birth of our nation as a single piece of parchment housed in the National Archives, the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, approved by the Second Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, established our nation and announced to the world that we were no longer bound to Great Britain. The courageous patriots representing the 13 original colonies in America, men like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, called the First Continental Congress a year earlier, in 1775, to express their grievances with Great Britain. They had complaints against England's treatment of the colonies. Back in 1775, their grievances were serious, but there was still enough loyal sentiment to prevent breaking ties with the mother country. Although the colonists wanted the right to shape their own destinies, they wanted to do it with England's blessings, certainly without having to wage war.
The Americans were brought into independence basically dragging and screaming, saying they didn't want to go, and they accepted it only because they determined by the middle of 1776 that they didn't have an alternative.
Dr. Pauline Maier, professor of history, MIT. Professor Maier is the author of American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence.
If they didn't declare their independence, they were going to be destroyed.
For over 150 years, men and women from the British Isles and Europe had been braving 3,000 miles of treacherous ocean in small boats to find freedom on the American continent. These refugees from political and religious oppression, from war and poverty, were building a new world for a new kind of people. They wanted peace and prosperity in their new homeland. These were Britain's colonies, established by royal charter, governed by royal appointees, subject to British laws, and dependent on the mother country for supplies and trade. Britain's armies protected the colonies from domination by the French and from Indian attack.
All the Americans started out loyal to Britain.
By the mid-18th century, Britain's Atlantic colonies had grown into thriving communities. The total population of 1.5 million was primarily native-born, young, male, aggressive. Mobility, both social and geographical, marked this new society of transplanted Englishmen. There was no limit to the wealth and position a man might achieve in America if he had courage and initiative and was willing to work. But in order to keep control of the wealth and trade of these ambitious people, Britain's government tried to impose on the colonists the same limitations that had caused their forefathers to leave the old country. Peter Kalm, a Swedish university professor, had this observation when he visited America in 1748.
The colonists are forbidden to establish new manufactures which would turn to the disadvantage of the British commerce. They are not allowed to dig for any gold or silver unless they send them to England immediately. They have not the liberty of trading to any parts that do not belong to the British Dominion, and foreign traders are not allowed to send their ships to them.
His observations led him to conclude,
the English colonies of North America in the space of 40 or 50 years would be able to form a state by themselves, entirely independent of Old England.
His prediction proved amazingly accurate. During the next 25 years, the primary grievance American colonists had with Great Britain was the levying of taxes without representation and the making of laws without the consent of the governed. Severing ties with Great Britain came gradually and painfully. The inhabitants of the colonies included many loyalists to the motherland, and early attempts to unite in a common cause for independence failed. But by 1774, the strong hand of royal power was tightening around the rebellious American colonies. British leaders claimed the mother country could make any laws she pleased for them. King George III even went so far as to close down the law-making bodies in some colonies for a while. Americans, however, did not intend to give up the right of making their own laws. They saw that they must act together in order to get England to listen to them. Delegates from 12 colonies met in the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Hoping for a peaceful settlement of the quarrel, they wrote a letter to King George. They begged him to give the colonists their rights. The young, stubborn king did not even answer the letter. Meanwhile, British soldiers had been sent to Boston, Massachusetts, to see that new laws made in England were obeyed. Angry colonists had been arming themselves in case it should be necessary to fight for their rights. In April 1775, the British learned that gunpowder was hidden outside of Boston in Concord. Their red-coated soldiers marched there to capture it. On the way, at Lexington, Massachusetts, they clashed with some armed Americans. 8 Americans were killed. The shot that was heard round the world had been fired. The Revolutionary War had started. The next month, the Second Continental Congress began meeting. Congress chose George Washington as commander of the army to defend the colonies. Although fighting was going on in New England, most people did not want to break away from Britain. They still hoped to make the king give them their rights as British citizens. But early in 1776, word reached America that the king had sent many more British soldiers and even hired thousands of German mercenaries to put down the American rebellion. This news filled Americans with anger. During the spring of 1776, the idea of separating from Great Britain grew rapidly. Yet, not all colonists were convinced they should take the final step in cutting ties with Great Britain. On Friday, June 7, 1776, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, delegates to the Second Continental Congress met at the State House. The president of the Congress was John Hancock of Massachusetts. After Mr. Hancock took care of some regular business, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood up and announced,
"Upon instructions of my government in Virginia, I present the following resolution. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved."
Congress passed Lee's motion on June 8th and began the debate for and against declaring independence.
It's important to understand that the major debate over independence in the Second Continental Congress occurred well before the resolutions were adopted. They were held in a committee of the whole on June 8th and June 10th. That is a Saturday and a Monday. The Sunday they didn't meet. They went thoroughly over all the arguments for and against declaring independence. The opponents said they understood by that point that it was inevitable that the Americans would become independent. But several delegations had instructions from their home legislature that said they could not vote for a resolution in favor of independence. And it was hoped that those resolutions could be rescinded before a final vote came up.
The proponents of putting off independence argued that America was too weak to defend herself against the mighty British Empire. Before declaring independence, the colonies should get the promise of help from some other country, like France or Spain. The proposition's supporters responded that Lee's resolution called on Congress only to declare a fact which already exists. Until the colonies declared their independence, no European power could negotiate with them, receive an ambassador, or even allow American ships to enter their ports. By the end of the day, it became clear that only 7 colonies would vote yes. They were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Virginia, Georgia, and North Carolina. But it was necessary that all 13 colonies vote for independence. They must stay united. Otherwise, the Americans would not be strong enough to defeat the British and build a new nation.
So that was the circumstance. What the Congress did on June 10th was to delay a final vote on the resolutions that Richard Henry Lee had introduced on behalf of the Congress did not intend to take up the resolution again until early July, but just in case that it then decided to approve it, as it most likely would, it appointed a committee to draft a declaration. Now, the purpose of the declaration was to justify and to announce the decision for independence, primarily to the American people, I believe. So on June 11th, the Congress appointed this committee to have a draft for it to consider if and when it voted in favor of independence.
The committee had 5 members: Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams, a Massachusetts delegate, Pennsylvania's Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston from New York.
The best known member is, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who became the draftsman of the Declaration, but his role was probably not as extensive as he later claimed it to have been. The other members of particular importance were Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, but the 2 other members, Richard R. Livingston of New York and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, were not insignificant. Jefferson himself was young, 33. He had only arrived after a respite in Virginia in the middle of May. He was known as a particularly good writer for Congress. Congress had basically its writers' corps. When they had public documents to draft, they had a handful of people they would call on over and over again. So he was a very appropriate person to be given this responsibility.
John Adams is quoted as saying, "Jefferson had the reputation of a masterly pen." Therefore, when the 5 men came together in committee to create the Declaration of Independence, it was Jefferson who was called on to write it. The word declaration, used in political or legal terms, has strong meaning. A declaration announces and, for all practical purposes, enacts a new policy. It's also a legal instrument, a written statement of claims served on the defendant at the commencement of a civil action, and brings charges of wrongdoing in an emphatic way while appealing for public support. Jefferson knew this and wrote the Declaration with care, searching for just the right words. He crossed out words and added new ones. He was determined, as he put it, to place before mankind the common sense of the subject and make the Declaration of Independence an expression of the American mind. Jefferson stayed in this boarding house while in Philadelphia. Now called the Declaration House, it was here he wrote his draft of the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson's draft of the Declaration was completed, he submitted it to the committee. John Adams and Ben Franklin made a few small changes, and 17 days after the committee was formed, their work was completed. On June 28th, they presented the draft of the Declaration to John Hancock, who presided over the Congress. The Declaration was put to the delegates of the 13 colonies, who now had a monumental decision to make: to approve it and face the wrath of the mighty British Empire, or reject it and return the colonies to the misery of more